All right, so buckle up because today we're diving headfirst into the world of medieval biblical interpretation.
It's right.
And before you think, oh no, not another history lesson, trust me on this one.
Yeah, this is going to be good.
We're talking about Haymo of Halberstadt, ninth century scholar. And let me tell you, this guy, he knew how to dig deep into the book of Haggai, like really deep.
He wasn't just explaining the Bible.
Yeah.
It was more like he was using it to figure out his own world, his own time.
Exactly. Like imagine having a conversation with a prophet from thousands of years ago, but you're also trying to make sense of what's happening right now in your own backyard.
And that's what's so cool about him. He uses symbolism, typology. He's finding all these layers of meaning that we'd probably just totally skim over.
It's next level reading comprehension.
Yeah.
So it's not just about the story on the surface. It's about looking for those hidden messages, those clues that tell us something more.
It's like he's cracked the code or something.
And he starts right away with this idea that rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, well, it's not just about rebuilding the temple, it's about rebuilding ourselves too.
Inner transformation, right? Building that inner temple.
Yeah, and he takes it literally, calling virtues the building blocks of this inner space. Virtues, like actual bricks and mortar. I mean, what are some of these Haymo-approved building materials we should be using?
Well, he's big on things like faith, of course, and perseverance. Being able to resist temptation, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Making sure your actions actually match up with what you believe.
It's like he's saying, look, are you building a shack or a fortress here? You need a strong foundation if you want this thing to last.
It's about putting in the work, just like building a real structure.
Right. Intentional construction.
Yeah.
And this is where Hamo's obsession with the little things gets really fascinating. So he notices God speaks to Haggai on a very specific day, the 24th day of the month. Now, I'm like, okay, Anne? But not Hamo. He's like, hold on, there's got to be something more to this.
He sees that number 24, and he immediately connects it back to 12. And of course, 12 represents the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. He's drawing this line straight from the Old Testament to the New Testament.
It's like he's saying God's plan. It's all connected.
And it's all part of this bigger story. And speaking of connections, it's interesting how Hamo focuses on Zerubbabel, this governor who's in charge of rebuilding the temple. He keeps coming back to this guy.
So why this one dude? What's so special about Zerubbabel?
Well, for Hamo, Zerubbabel is like a prefigure of Christ. Think of it as foreshadowing in a movie, the way a character's journey hints at what's to come for the main hero.
I'm picking up what you're putting down. So Zerubbabel rebuilding the physical temple. That represents Jesus rebuilding, the spiritual temple.
Exactly. And it goes even deeper than that. Hamo points out that Zerubbabel is called both leader and servant in the text.
Wait, how do you pull off both of those at the same time? It seems kind of contradictory.
Well, it speaks to that classic Christian idea of Jesus being both fully divine, the king, and fully human, the suffering servant.
Ah, so Zerubbabel is like this prototype. He embodies that duality, that tension between leadership and servanthood.
And that, my friend, is vintage Hamo. He loves finding those little nuggets of foreshadowing, those echoes of Christ throughout the Old Testament.
This guy was like a walking, talking Bible code breaker. Amazing.
Yeah.
Makes you think about how we define leadership, right? It's not just about being in charge. It's about using that position to, to lift others up.
Exactly. Service is a part of true leadership, for sure.
Love it. Okay, so moving on to another image that Hamo seems to really like, this idea of God shaking the heavens and the earth.
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds pretty intense. So is he talking literal earthquakes here, or is there a metaphorical layer to this too?
Well, you got to love a good biblical earthquake, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. It's not always about the ground literally shaking. In these prophetic books, it often represents this big upheaval, this change that's happening in the universe, but also within people.
Yeah.
And Haymo, he sees this shaking as a metaphor for Christ coming to disrupt the old way of doing things, to bring in something totally new.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's like you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, but on a cosmic scale.
Exactly. And it makes me think about those times in life where it feels like everything's falling apart.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just making room for something new to come in.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
It's about trusting that even in those moments of chaos, there's a bigger plan happening.
Yeah.
And Haymo, he doesn't shy away from some pretty dramatic examples either. He brings up things like, the Red Sea parting, the giving of the law at Mount Sinai,
Mm.
even earthquakes that happened during Jesus's time. Like he's drawing this line, like
Yeah.
connecting all these different events throughout history,
It's like he's weaving them all together.
showing how God's power is woven through all of
I've
it.
been picking that up, yeah. So we've got the outer temple and the inner temple, right? But Haima also talks about this idea of spiritual contamination.
Oh, yeah.
And he uses a really interesting example to illustrate it.
Yeah, the whole consecrated meat versus dead body thing, it's a little out there for like the modern listener, I think.
It's a little bit out there, yeah.
But it would have made total sense to people back then. They had all these rules about ritual purity, about what's considered clean and what's unclean.
Right, right. And he's not just talking about like washing your hands before dinner here. He's using this very specific example to make a bigger point. Like we need to be careful about what we let influence us, right? What we allow into that inner temple that we're building.
Yeah, it's about being mindful of what we're letting in, the things that can contaminate our thoughts, our actions, our relationships even,
Hmm.
safeguarding that inner space.
It's like that old saying, you are what you eat, but for our minds and our souls.
Right. Just like we want to nourish our bodies with healthy food,
Hmm.
we've got to be mindful of what we're feeding our spirits.
Okay, I have to ask. With all this talk about building and shaking and purifying, is there ever a point where Hamo just, like, chills out?
He likes to keep us on our toes. But seriously, there's a reason for all the intensity. He wants people to really get how important this inner work is. This isn't just some abstract concept, you know. This stuff has real consequences for how we live our lives.
It's not enough to just go through the motions.
Oh, no, you got to be active in it. You got to want it.
And that brings us back to the rebuilding of the temple, right? Hema points out this really interesting thing. He says that before the temple was rebuilt, people would expect a big harvest, but they wouldn't get it. They'd end up with hardly anything. But then, after they finally get around to rebuilding that temple, boom, abundance everywhere. What's the takeaway there?
It's like our outer actions. They're only as good as the inner transformation that's driving them. Like Hamo was saying, you can't just go through the motions of, religious rituals or doing good deeds outwardly and expect some kind of amazing reward. It doesn't work like that.
So it's not enough to just show up at the temple. You have to, like, really show up in your own life.
You got it. It's about getting your priorities straight, making sure your actions are coming from a place of real belief, real spiritual growth. And then, maybe then, you get to experience that abundance.
It's like he's saying, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. But with a medieval twist, you can't just rely on outward rituals. You've got to cultivate that inner landscape, too.
Absolutely. It's about bringing those two things into alignment, our inner world and our outer actions. And that's where the real growth happens.
It's amazing to me how much Hamo manages to pull out of these ancient texts. It's like he's got this whole other level of understanding that most of us just glance over.
He was a product of his time. Medieval thinkers saw the world as this intricate web of meaning, with God's presence woven through everything. They believed that even the smallest details held spiritual significance.
It's like they had these special glasses that allowed them to see things we miss. And while we might not interpret things exactly the same way today, I think there's something really inspiring about that mindset.
It reminds us to slow down, to pay attention to the details, to look for those deeper connections. The world becomes a much richer place when we do that.
I completely agree. This has been such a fascinating deep dive. We've explored symbolism, typology, spiritual contamination, even biblical earthquakes. It's amazing how much ground Hamo covers in his commentary.
He was a true scholar, deeply engaged with these texts and their relevance for his own time. And, even though he was writing centuries ago, I think there's a lot we can still learn from him today.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our journey into Hamo's world, I'm curious, what's resonating with you? What insights are you taking away from this deep dive?
For me, it's that reminder to be intentional about cultivating our inner lives.
Mm.
Just like we take care of our physical health, we need to nurture our spiritual well-being.
That's such a powerful takeaway. And Hamo would probably say it's not just about reading scripture, it's about embodying its teachings, about building that inner temple with care and intention.
He'd also probably encourage us to look for those deeper layers of meaning in everything we do, in every interaction, in every experience.
Mm.
Who knows what hidden gems we might uncover?
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of Haymo of Halberstadt. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep building those inner temples.